I say the word presentation to you, what comes to mind? Is it hundreds of PowerPoint slides with teeny tiny text and images so small that no one can read them, let alone understand what you're trying to say? Maybe like me, your mouth is dropping to your stomach at the thought of being on stage and everyone looking at you. Whatever your thoughts and feelings are on the topic, one thing's for sure. As a leader, you're going to have to do it, and often. I'm Lee Griffith, a communication strategist, executive coach and champion of leaders who do things differently and reject the old school stereotypes. In the Leaders with Impact podcast, I'm here to help you get clear on your strategy, implement some self-leadership and connect with those you serve through your communications so that you can deliver improved organisational performance. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a review over on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. In today's episode, I'm talking with presentation trainer Fiona Walsh about how you can speak with impact. Whether it's a board meeting, town hall staff session, or you're on stage in front of hundreds of your peers. We talk about how to avoid the many pitfalls presenters face and what you can practically do to speak with confidence, convey your message with clarity, and win the hearts and minds of your audience. Enjoy. So today I'm delighted to be talking with Fiona Walsh, who's a presentation and PowerPoint trainer. And we're looking at how leaders can be more impactful in the way that they speak and present. And I know from the leaders that I've worked with in the past, not everyone's really comfortable with that thought of standing up and speaking. And I'll admit from the off, this was not something that was in my comfort zone when I worked in corporate. I was far more comfortable behind the scenes than being on stage. And so I think what I've certainly noticed in my career, and it'd be interesting in your thoughts, Fiona, is this sense that leaders can sometimes create this protection shield around them when they have to speak, and also known as death by PowerPoint. So I'm sure we're going to cover a lot of that in today's conversation. But I suppose to start and to get us on the right track, for you, what makes a speaker impactful?
I think there's a number of elements there, really. Firstly, it's the content of what they're saying. I mean, they need to have a hook to start with. You need to have something to draw your audience in at the beginning. You need to have passion when you're speaking. You need to have voice tone variation. If you're talking with a monotone voice all the time, it can get very difficult to listen to. And I suppose that's where the passion comes in. When we're able to raise our voice and really speak with passion, you can hear that in somebody's voice. That's one thing that certainly helps make people impactful. I also think practicing. I think a lot of people don't realise how important it is to practice.
Picking up on the practice element, is it something that you're either a good speaker or not, or is it something that you can learn to speak well? I suppose, how do you get to that point of being impactful?
Practice, definitely, yeah. I think there are, some people may be born good speakers. I think it depends on their background and probably their upbringing as to whether they had an environment where they could speak out. I think I grew up in the UK as well, although I live in Ireland now, but I think certainly the background that I grew up in school, you didn't stand up and speak in front of people, really. You're always told to be quiet and shut up. So that doesn't really help. I know things have changed a lot in that time. And I think that people coming through schools now have the opportunity to start speaking at an earlier age. And I think that helps. But it definitely is something that can be learnt. I am not an active Toastmaster at the moment, but I have been a Toastmaster. And it really helps the practice. It's like a muscle that we have to use. And if we don't practice it, then we can lose that ability to do it well. If we practice it, it's much easier to get over our fears. Not everybody has fears, but it's one of the top fears. Public speaking is supposed to be above dying or around the same level of percentage of people that fear things. Public speaking is really up there as one of the top fears, and practice certainly helps with that, without a doubt.
For those who don't know, what's a Toastmaster?
Toastmaster is an organisation that runs throughout the world that allows people to practice public speaking.
Right.
in an environment, in a safe environment. So if you Google them, you'll find Toastmasters for the UK or wherever you're located, and then you'll be able to find local groups. And you pay like a fee to join, and then probably a fee when you go along each week. They tend to run weekly or bi-weekly, and people can go along first of all just to see what happens in it, and then you would be invited to do, probably it's not really a welcome speech, can't remember exactly what it's called, but you're just talking about yourself and your background. They're usually in between 4 and 6 minutes that you're speaking. So it's not like you're doing a 30-minute presentation, which could be quite stressful. It's a short presentation. And as you go along through the program, you will get more formal feedback. So you will be giving formal presentations, and then you might be asking the audience, or you'll have people that are formally giving you feedback. So there'll be nominated people to give feedback, and you might be asking for feedback on how many filler words am I using? How's my body language? Am I overdoing it with the body language? Am I not making any body language? Just feedback on different aspects of your presentation.
Okay, so we'll add a link in the show notes for people who might be interested in exploring that as an option to help them with their practicing. I wanted to touch on the fact that I suppose most leaders or in organisations aren't standing on a stage delivering TED Talks, for example, but they're having to present in all shapes and sizes of crowds on a fairly regular basis. So whether it's presenting at the board, it might be all staff meetings, it could be public events or public meetings of some sort. And often they're presenting on general updates on the state of the business, or maybe their area of responsibility within the business. And I'm mindful of your description of what makes an impactful speaker, and passion being one of them. And I suppose those two things, passion and general updates of the business, don't always tend to make a great marriage. So what can leaders do to help them tap into that passion? And I suppose a by result of that would be that they become more engaging and impactful in the way that they speak.
I think it's the awareness of them speaking. So maybe recording yourself delivering a presentation in front of those people or in that environment can help give you some insights. Because if you're practicing, and I certainly wouldn't recommend practicing in front of a mirror or something like that, because you're looking at yourself. And that doesn't help, because in an environment where you are speaking, you're not actually looking at yourself then. So it's kind of giving you a negative practice environment. You could practice in your own environment, but you could record that, and then you could watch that back and see, how could you make that more impactful? Or even if you're able to get a recording, perhaps it's an online update you're doing, if you're able to record that, and then you can get some feedback. Or even asking people in the audience, I'm going to deliver this presentation today. Maybe there's somebody there that you could ask for feedback as to how you could improve. Because, if we don't get any feedback, we're not going to improve. And sometimes it's not always a good environment to get feedback. But, maybe there's one person that you could ask for genuine feedback as to how you're presenting.
Yeah. And what's the type of things that people are generally having to work on when they're looking to change and improve the way that they're presenting?
I think a big one, and that's probably my worst habit as well, is filler words. Things like are, like, it's those type of words that can be very distracting when you're delivering a presentation, because once an audience member has noticed it, every time you and are, it's grating on for them, for the audience member. And remember, when we're speaking, it's about the audience, it's not about us. I think that's probably one of the biggest things. And even just having that awareness of the fact that you're saying them can be helpful. What I would like to point out, I'm trying very hard now not to use them myself. What I would like to point out is the reason we use filler words is because we're talking too fast for our brain to catch up. And that's why the filler words come in. And if we slow our speech down a little bit, we're thinking about what we want to say before we say it, and the filler words are less likely to come.
Right.
So that's the main reason, because I think I didn't use any in the last few sentences while I was describing that because I spoke a lot slower.
Yeah.
I'm prone to speaking very fast as well. So it's something that I really have to work on when I'm doing public speaking to make sure I slow down enough to not use the filler words. So that is the number one reason we use them, not habit, because we're talking too fast.
Yeah. I had a no, I'm going to be really self-conscious about using them myself. I worked with a leader once who spoke really fast and would always and ah to the point it was really distracting. And I would sit at the back of the room. This was part of I brought his awareness to this being quite an issue and a barrier for him to connect with people. And we worked on it. And what we did would, I'd be at the back of the room, and every time he used a filler word, I'd put my hand up in the air. So he was getting, he would suddenly get this visual, and
not a
he
filler word.
started to slow it down, and eventually he had brought that awareness to himself that I wouldn't say they completely went, but they were definitely more
less frequent.
Less frequent, yes. So it's that's definitely something that people, when we all do it, don't we?
Yes, we do. And the problem is that when we're speaking, we tend to get, generally speaking here, we tend to get a little bit nervous, or most people get a little bit nervous. So there's a little bit of adrenaline going on, and they're going to speak a bit faster because of the adrenaline. So unfortunately, that goes hand in hand with the filler words coming, because most people, when they're speaking in that environment, until they get used to it, until they get practiced, are going to be a little bit nervous. So there's a few more tips in relation to that. First one is telling ourselves that the feeling of that adrenaline, when it starts pumping, the feeling of nervousness is the same feeling as excitement.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing. It's just labeled differently. So rather than saying, "Oh God, I can feel those butterflies coming. I'm starting to feel nervous," we can try relabeling and saying to ourselves, "Oh, I'm starting to feel a bit excited because I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do this really well." It's the same feeling. It's the same hormone that's starting to be released. So we could try relabeling that and saying, "Oh, I'm actually excited about that," because it is the same feeling as when you're excited.
Mm.
That's the first thing. There's another couple of things that you can do. One is breathing, because when we're breathing, we are helping ourselves relax, but it's quite specific breathing. So rather than deep breathing does help, but if we breathe out for longer than we breathe in, that then regulates our brain and our hormones, and that will relax us more. So even if you take a deep breath in quickly and breathe out slowly, so if you can count out for longer on the breath out, that's going to calm your heart rate down. It's going to calm everything down. So even if you took a deep breath for a couple of seconds and tried to breathe out for 6 seconds, that's going to calm you down. You can feel your heart rate slowing as you do that. So there's the out breath as long as you can.
And I do that quite often as a practice, and breath practice is something, but I tend to do that in my own private space away from anyone. So is that something that people do before they get on stage to present, or is there a breathing technique whilst they're presenting that would come into play?
That one is, you don't have to, I did a very loud in-breath then, but you could do that quite quietly. You could still do, through your nose, but quickly, and then out slowly. You could do that counting, just try and do it. And then the slow breath out, you can count that out. What was the other thing that I was going to say there? I've got distracted. Yes, there's another one, which is to do with when you're speaking, to always breathe in at the end of a sentence.
Right.
So if you're talking out, then I take a breath in, and that breath in forces me to pause, because you can't speak while you're breathing in. We actually speak while we're breathing out. And we've got a breath in, and that breath in at the end of the sentence allows us to think about what we're going to say next. So it's that little pause that lets us think about the next thing we're going to say, which can help those filler words not be there.
Okay. It's when I first started yoga, I really hated the fact that it felt like my breathing was back to front, and I was having to be far more conscious, and that explanation almost feels like there's a bit of back to frontness. But I've never actually paid attention to how I do breathe when I'm speaking. So is it something that we're doing naturally anyway, but it is about bringing some mindfulness to that?
We're probably not thinking about it when we're speaking because most of us are too nervous.
Mm.
That's the catch. We're thinking, oh, I'm feeling nervous. Is this going to be okay? And most people forget then to, even though they might know these tools, they might forget to actually use them. And that's part of the issue, unfortunately. That's why you have to try telling yourself you're excited first rather than you're nervous when you get those feelings. I'm excited because I'm going to get up there and I'm going to do this great presentation. That's what I'm excited about. But yeah, a lot of the time we forget to use those breathing tips.
Yeah. And I suppose part of it must be also that for us, taking a breath probably feels like an age, but to the audience, they need to take a breath as well. If you're going really quickly and they're trying to stay on track, it's a really helpful way for all of you to slow it down, for them to understand what you're saying to them even.
Absolutely. And even when we are speaking, it sounds very slow to us, but you have to remember, as you've just said there, our audience has to process what we've said because they don't, you know what it is you're saying, you know the topic that you're trying to get across. You can do it quite quickly, speak about it quite quickly, and you know what you're talking about. But for them, they need to be able to process what it is you've said. And some people do that slower than others.
Mm.
So some people might need those pauses. And that's another thing, pausing when we're speaking. People don't do that enough. A pause to us, I've just done one there, can feel like a really long time when we're in front of people, but it isn't. We can use pauses for effect.
Yeah.
If we've got something really important to say, we can have a big pause before so that people are listening. You'd see the audience sort of starting to lean forward a little bit to say, oh, what's coming? And then we can deliver the bit with impact because we've had that pause. And pauses also allow us to gather our thoughts as well. So if we aren't clear on what we're going to say next, or maybe somebody's asked us a question, we can pause while we gather our thoughts before we're going to carry on and respond.
Okay, so we've got filler words, we've got being aware of your breath, slowing down the way you speak. We've got that awareness around the nervous energy you might be bringing and using pauses and all of that to bring effect so that you take your audience with you. What else are useful tips for leaders who are trying to make a better impact in the way that they're coming across?
I think having a clear message.
Yeah.
And one way to help with your message is to use the rule of threes.
Yeah.
Where we've got 3 topics. Threes are very easy for us to remember. There's been quite a bit of research on this from the audience point of view. So if I say to you, right, I've got 10 points, and I start listing off my 10 points, you will most likely remember 3. You might remember 4, but you certainly will not remember 10.
Mm-hmm.
If we start with when we're presenting and we're talking to our audience and we're telling them we're going to have 3 points, they will more likely remember those 3 points as the takeaways from our presentation. The rule of threes is also something that helps the speaker because as the person presenting, you're likely to remember those 3 points as well. Now, I can guess there's probably somebody in the audience saying, oh, yeah, but I have got 10 things to get across. And I understand that. Can you take those 10 things? Maybe you can incorporate a couple in one topic. Perhaps you can take those. So maybe we've got 9 then. Hopefully you'll see where I'm going with this. Can you have 3 topics that those other topics would fit into so that we've got the rule of threes, we've got our first topic, and maybe there's 3 things within there. Our second topic, maybe there's 2 or 3 things within there. And our third topic, perhaps we've got 3 things there as well. So it just helps the audience get it, and it helps us when we're presenting. Because I can almost guarantee that if somebody stood up to present 10 things and they didn't really have any prompts or PowerPoint presentation behind them, so that they didn't know what the next slide was going to be, should we say, they're not going to remember the 10th thing or the 9th thing. And then they'll get to the end of the presentation and they'll say, oh, damn it, I forgot to say what have you. Whereas if we break it down into these threes, it makes it easy for us as an audience member to take them away, but it also makes it easy for a presenter to remember them.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to be reading from a piece of paper either. That's not presenting. That's, not quite the same.
No. I wanted to swing back, I suppose, to the point around the hook and that being an important part of making that impact in the way that you're talking if you're giving a speech or a presentation. And the point about a lot of the stuff that leaders talk about can be really dry to them and to others. How do you find a hook in something that perhaps to everyone is just business as usual and I'm not necessarily going to rally the troops?
Yeah. And there might not, I mean, if you're doing monthly updates and you're doing the same, I don't mean the same update, because obviously it's going to be different each month, but you've got the same type of update that you're doing each month, that might be challenging because there might not really be anything every month. There could be one month, there could be something that is a bit more difficult, not difficult, different. And that's where you could try and, do things a little bit differently on that particular occasion. So sometimes it could be even thinking things out. So let's say I had somebody in a training session recently, and we had 2 training sessions. This is PowerPoint, and there were 2 weeks in between the training sessions, and they came back. It was a group session, it was online, and I was chatting to people before we started, and one of the people said, I saved 3 hours in the last 2 weeks doing a repetitive task. So 3 hours in 2 weeks. I could turn that 3 hours into how much time could that person save in a year? Okay, so if we're saying 3 hours, wasn't it, in 2 weeks? If we're saying 3 hours in 2 weeks, I could times that by maybe not 26 because there's a few days, a few weeks holidays, but I could sort of do a calculation on that and I could say, right, from that training, that person would have saved, I can't remember, it's 1 week, 2 weeks work. That's a huge amount of time. When you think of it like that, it's more like calculating things out to build something, or or the other way around. If there's a cost saving, that cost saving might only be, let's say 1,000. But what's that over 5 years? If we make that change, if we change that supply and we save 1,000, what's that going to be? Is that 1,000 a month? That doesn't sound like a big figure, but over the year, that's 12,000. If we do it to other departments, that could then turn into 36,000. Over the years, that's going to be, that could be so many headcount. That's how you create a story. It's almost like, there's different elements and different layers to it, and how can we either expand it or put a different slant on it to get it to mean more?
Yeah.
And that also comes into a bit on, I suppose, it's data visualization as well. If you were using a PowerPoint, there's a story around the data. So let's say you're doing a presentation and it's facts and figures, and you've got a graph on a slide, perhaps because we're doing a monthly updates. The person looking at that graph could be getting something very different from it, depending on who they are and what's relevant to them. So, for example, there could be, let's say if we were looking at figures from last month to this month, some figures could be static, some could have gone down, some could have gone up. What are we trying to say from that information? What's important to our audience? So, for example, it could be something stayed the same. Why haven't we got any growth? We need to focus on that because there hasn't been any growth. Perhaps something's declined, and that could be, maybe it was near misses have declined. So that's great. What were we doing there? What can we reproduce in other areas of the business to get that to happen elsewhere? Perhaps it's a growth in something. So, okay, what happened there to get that to grow? How can we get that growth in the other areas of the business? It's almost about focusing on the part that's relevant to the audience. And I suppose that leads on to the fact that the audience are really our biggest, most important thing here. And it's thinking about what do the audience need to hear? What's the message that you could have same piece of data, but one audience it could be a different message to one audience compared to another audience, even though it was the same bit of data we're presenting or the same presentation. So it's around thinking of our audience as well and what they need to hear and what's relevant to them.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I get flashbacks quite often to when I was a comms director, and I would have many an argument with people who would basically say, "Oh, I need a slide deck of information," but actually, what they needed was a report or a board paper. It definitely wasn't a slide deck to present to people. And probably everyone listening to this has sat in a meeting or two where you're just reading the slides that someone's got rather than paying any attention to the person in front of you.
Yeah.
But we can't seem to break out of that cycle, that it just seems to perpetuate in organizations. So I suppose my question, and you've touched on it a bit around the rule of three and focusing in on what that message for that audience might be. But how can a leader start to, I suppose, rip up the rule book, although it's not a great rule book, but rip it up and start and break that cycle, I suppose?
It can be hard when a company's always done it that way, because that's what people are expecting to see. I think one of the worst things I would see is too much information on a slide. I mean, I see it over and over again. Too much information on a slide, audience not being able to read it, audience not being able to see it. Why bother? Why have you got a PowerPoint slide deck that has all this information on that nobody can see? There's so many different things you can do with PowerPoint, and I guess people may not be aware of the things you can do. So, for example, you can create movies with PowerPoint. You can create animation and you can export it as an MP4 file. That would be a completely different scenario, of course, to standing up at a keynote and delivering a presentation. And then you've got the internal type meetings, and also you've got what we call sliduments, which is really a document made with PowerPoint. So they're going to be all created in very, very different ways for those audiences. And I suppose that's where I was touching on the audience and thinking about the audience. Who is it that's going to be consuming that PowerPoint, and in what format? Is it something that's going to be read by people? I think a common mistake people have is that they assume that the same PowerPoint slides will work for any audience in any scenario. And they don't. They absolutely do not. I was at a presentation recently by one of the big four auditing companies, and one of the people were presenting, and this person kept saying, as you can see from the slides, the text on the slide, it was a handout slide basically. So I couldn't see anything from the slides. I couldn't even read the title of the slide. That's how poor the presentation was. Now, the presentation was a perfect handout to be sent around as a PDF afterwards. It was not presenting in front of an audience. And then I did actually offer feedback, and I got to speak to the EA who had created the slides. And interestingly enough, she said to me, I've been trying to tell them this for years and they're not listening. So it's really great to have some feedback. So now I can say, can we please try it my way? Where she would have done two decks. She would have done a deck to hand out, which would have been perfect, the PDF, and she would have done a pared down deck with a lot less content on that people could read.
How do you determine, I suppose, what you need, whether actually what you're giving is a speech versus a presentation, or whether you need some slides to illustrate your point, or you're just using them as some visual filler to help guide through or get people thinking, when you might need text versus photos, for example? Like, how do you start to determine the approach that's going to have the best impact and work for you as a presenter as well?
Yeah, I have an approach called the 3 pillars. So I call it 3 pillars of PowerPoint, and I suppose the end result of that is, do you need a deck at all? Which kind of leads nicely into this conversation. So the first pillar is people. Who are we presenting on, which we've already sort of touched on there. It might be a keynote in front of 1,000 people. It could be presenting to the board. It could be presenting to your team. So that's who it is to start with. And not just who it is, but how well do you know those people? And what are they looking for out of your presentation? What do they need to get from your presentation? Okay, so people first. Then we have purpose. Why are you presenting? And when I ask people that question, why are you presenting? I get answers like, because my boss has asked me to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not the reason why you're presenting. Okay, so that's something that I really try and get people to think about. Why are you presenting? You're trying to get some information across. You're trying to inform people about something. You're trying to inspire people. What is it? Inform, inspire, and influence.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got 3 I's there as to what we're trying to do. Why are we presenting? There's always a reason why we're presenting, otherwise we wouldn't be presenting. Just people don't really think of it in that way. And what I say to people is that if there's a purpose for presenting, we should have a call to action. Now, the call to action doesn't need to be buy now or the price goes up 500% tomorrow. It's not that type of call to action like you'll see on social media. It can be a very subtle call to action. For example, let's say we're informing people, staff, maybe this is a staff update, maybe it's team, depending on how things are running. We're informing people of a new staff update, of a new staff appraisal system. And we've gone through some of the top level information in a presentation. We want to get people to go away, think about what they've seen, read some more information, and come back to us by a certain date. That could be our call to action. Okay, we've done the initial presentation now. Can you go away, read the information that's at this location, and come back with any questions by 4 p.m. on Wednesday? If we don't have a call to action, that's quite a subtle one, but it's still nevertheless telling people what we want the next steps to be from their side. Those people, or some of those people, might have very good intentions of going away and reading that bit of information. However, they're busy, something comes up, they have another deadline. If they don't know that you want them to do it by 4 p.m. on Wednesday, they might not get around to it for 3 weeks' time. And by that time, it's too late because you've moved on to the next step. And it's because you didn't have a call to action. Okay, so it can be very, very subtle. But what I would recommend is that we finish on a call to action. What do you want people to do at the end of the presentation?
Yeah.
Perhaps we want to get them to think a little bit more. So perhaps it's a question we ask them, not as in we want you to go away and read this and come back. That's more like we were giving them a deadline, but perhaps we want them to go and think about what improvements can we make in the canteen. That's something to go and think about. Perhaps it's something like that we end on a call to action. If we are presenting to executive committee or various committees and we're looking for buy-in for something, maybe we actually need to say, these are the next steps. Yeah. I'm looking for approval from you to sign off on the funds. And after you've done that, this is going to happen and this is going to happen. This is going to happen. But the first step is you approving. So that's the call to action. I want you to approve this much in funds so that I can go and run this project.
Yeah. I think that's so you've hit on a couple of things there that come up in the conversations that I have with the people that I work with, and they often say, "Oh, I'm not getting the board buy-in on X, Y, and Z." And then when we talk through, and I go, "Well, what's the clarity in your message? What were you hoping to achieve? What are they likely to be interested and want to hear from you? And have you managed their expectations around what's going to happen as a result of this conversation?" Yeah. And often it's, "Oh, no, 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 no." And I think leaders particularly, and leaders particularly can think about what I'm trying to achieve, what I need to get out of this conversation, where I'm going. And they don't take that beat to go, hang on a minute, I can only do what I can do if I know what these people want to hear and do and say, and are likely to respond to what I want.
Yeah. I was running a software implementation project as a consultant, and I investigated 3 systems and was asked to present to the board. So I presented to the board and gave an overview of the 3 systems. So it was a slide, had a bit of information on. They can ask for more information if they wanted to. I gave the information, and I had a slide next saying next steps. And the next steps were, you agree the funds, I ask for the invoice, you pay the invoice, I get access to the system, and implementation starts. So that was my ask. I want you to agree the funds to go with supplier X. So you've had a quick overview of the other 2 suppliers. So we've done our due diligence to make sure that we have that data there. They've seen that data. Half an hour later, I got a response, yes, go ahead. But the feedback I had was that it was the best presentation that they had ever experienced, because I had a call to action. And I asked them, I want you to approve to do this, rather than here's an overview of my findings, and letting them go through and say, well, what should we do? I was trying to take that decision away from them and saying, They're paying me as a consultant. This is what I want you to do. This is the system that I recommend. I just need you to confirm you're happy to do that.
Yeah. And
Half an hour later, I got my yes, go ahead.
People can get so frustrated that, oh, well, I've done this presentation, or I've presented this case, or whatever it might be, and people went off on a tangent, or people got into the detail and I didn't want them to do that. And you're like, well, what were the conditions that you set in before you even started?
Yeah, absolutely. And, if there's something there that isn't up for discussion when you're presenting, there's no harm in saying that.
Mm-hmm.
We all know this is on the table. That's not for discussion today. Say it at the beginning, and then nobody can ask you any questions. Or if they do, you can say, at the beginning, we agreed that that's not for discussion. So that's not the topic that we're discussing today. We're actually here to discuss this. So I'll take questions on this. Because if you're presenting, you're in control, so you can set those boundaries.
Yeah.
And another tip as well is questions, either a question slide, or even if you're not doing a slide, questions. What I would commonly see is people finishing with questions. And I would recommend that you don't do that. The reason being that you could, two things, or two main reasons, I suppose. You could get no questions at all. If you're presenting to the exec, it's probably a bit more informal, because then they're going to say, "Oh, that's fine," and you go off. But let's say it's a staff update type environment, or a bit more formal environment. You could get no questions, and then you stand in there thinking, "Well, I finished my presentation. I don't have any questions. Do I sit down? Do I stand here for a bit longer? How long do I leave it until I say, oh, no questions then, sit down?" Another thing is you could get asked a question that you can't answer. So what's your plan for that? What are you going to do if you get a question that you can't answer? If I get asked questions in training that I can't answer, if I'm in in-person training, I have a whiteboard. The question goes on the whiteboard and who's asked it, so I can come back to them afterwards. What's your plan if you get asked a question you can't answer? Okay. The other thing is that you could, there could be somebody in the audience who is trying to derail you a little bit and asking you a purposely awkward question. So you've got that as well. So what would people remember at the end of your presentation if you get asked that really sticky question? Maybe it's somebody trying to be smart, maybe it's the one you can't answer, and that's it, the presentation's over. They'll most likely remember, oh, wasn't that awkward at the end of there when, that question was asked? And, oh, I remember the look on their face when they couldn't answer it. So what I would advise is it's okay to have questions, but don't have questions as your final part of your presentation. So if you have questions or a question slide, have another slide afterwards so that you can move swiftly on and you can summarize and you can get your call to action in. So even if you say, does anybody have any questions? And there isn't any questions, you could decide, how long am I going to leave it for? I'll count down a few seconds, what have you, and you can say, okay, let's move on. You move on, you've got your summary, you finish at a nice, powerful, strong ending. And that's what people would remember.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful advice, because we've all. I'm getting those images of meetings where the presenter ends up just randomly calling on people and asking them questions in the spirit to start conversation, and you're just like, no, stop it.
Yeah. And another one, if you do want to encourage questions, maybe it is something like the example I used earlier with the new performance management system, that type of thing, and you want to encourage questions, you could always plant a question in the audience, or say to somebody, get a colleague and say, look, can you think of a question to ask? Somebody that you know is going to ask something, or you can say, would you ask this question? Get them to ask a specific question, and that might start things off, and then other people might feel a bit more comfortable about asking them as well.
Yeah.
That's another tip you could try.
I was thinking, as you were talking about some of the challenges that people come up against when they are presenting, and the other one that I've seen happen is when the audience almost go dead behind the eyes. They switch off quite literally, or they're on their phones and they're just not engaging with you, and you just get in the sense that you are not landing in the way you should. What do you do in those types of circumstances?
Yeah, that one is a very good question. I think it's a case of changing your tack, and pretty quickly. Now, that's something that's going to be a lot more challenging for, let's say, inexperienced speakers, because if you have your presentation, and I don't mean necessarily slides, but if you have your presentation planned out and then you realize it's not going very well, you've got to change how things are done. And that can be quite challenging, I think, as an inexperienced presenter. It's the type of thing that if that really happens to you, you'll probably maybe think of some things afterwards, but it might be a bit challenging at the time. I've seen some presenters do some interesting things where they've started asking the audience questions rather than asking for questions, but they've started off in a really interesting way. Well, where they'll say, right, let's warm up on questions. We're going to practice a question now. Who had breakfast this morning? Put your hands up. And then obviously most people put their hands up. Okay, you got the idea of how it's going to go. So they can start asking questions to get a bit of buy-in from the audience. But starting off, rather than saying a really, really complicated question that probably no one's going to answer, or if you answer it, you think you might be then put on the spot by having to elaborate more because you've answered the question. They start off with a hands up, and that can get people out of that sort of, glazed eye environment or mindset or what have you. So yeah, start asking questions, but rather than making it difficult for the audience, start by doing a hands up, easy questions.
Yeah.
That they can just put their hands up and say, okay, yeah, I get the hang of this. And then you can start maybe asking something a little bit more specific. But it might be that you don't expect people to actually answer, that they'll do a hands up type thing, because that's a bit easier for people.
Yeah.
That would probably shake them out of their slumber.
Moving to a bit of a broader topic, but one that some leaders will want to have a bit more of a platform for their views. Perhaps they're establishing themselves as a thought leader. Maybe they've got some strategic imperative in the organisation, which means they need to have a higher profile, regionally, nationally, internationally, whatever that might be. So they start going to the big conferences, the big events to share what they are doing or their organisation are doing. And they are going to be very different events to those in-house local set pieces. So what should people be mindful of if they're making that transition to the bigger scale events?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Most of those events will be looking for slides.
Yeah.
Majority of them. Some of them are panel speaking, I suppose. That's a little bit different. But if you're up on stage, there's a good chance you're going to have slides. First thing you want to do is find out from the organisers what setup you have. What slide size do you have? What you'll find is that most larger conference type facilities will have widescreen projectors. Well, not projectors, but widescreen equipment.
Yeah.
If you are in a hotel environment, a lot of hotels still have overhead projectors. Now, they're not like the old-fashioned ones that used to be sitting on the table in the meeting room.
Yeah.
We've moved on from those a bit, but they are. I actually went to a hotel recently, and they just had a refurbishment, and they had the most amazing kit I have ever seen. So they pressed a button, and this concertina type thing came down from the ceiling with this massive overhead projector on it that then shone onto the screen. It was also a wedding venue, which I think most hotels, for these type of function rooms would be. So that would go back up into the ceiling, and then the screen goes up when they have weddings in there, for example. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is that, or the reason I'm mentioning the difference in equipment is that the slide size is different when you're presenting.
Right.
So if you are presenting, and our default in PowerPoint is a widescreen. If you've got an overhead projector and you're presenting in widescreen, you lose a third of your slide. It's just a black bar. So you've got a black bar at the top and the bottom. So the first thing I would want to know is what slide size do I need? What equipment have we got? So overhead projector is standard slide size, and some form of monitor or, really large equipment that's going to go through, rather than the light shining on it, is going to be widescreen, which is the default. So most of our corporate templates are going to be widescreen. A lot of companies will also have an OHP size, or the standard slide size template as well for these events. So that's something to find out, because otherwise you're missing some of the size of the slides to start with. I would also want to know what the setup is going to be like in relation to what you're going to see as the presenter. I went to a conference in Birmingham's Millennium Point last month, and I was so impressed by the setup that I got up on stage after asking the organisers, asked if I could take a picture of the setup for the speakers. So the screen behind them was absolutely huge. And on stage, probably about level with the stage, there were two widescreen monitors. One had the slide that the audience were looking at on it, and the other one had the presenter view, where the presenters could see their bullets, their notes in bullet form. But it was perfect because it meant that nobody had to turn around to look at the screen. So I would want to know from anybody who was organising that event, what's that setup going to be like? Because then you'll know if you can rely on the presenter view or not. I see pictures almost every day of people on LinkedIn that are presenting at an event, and there's a picture and they go, here's me presenting at this event, and the picture is of them turning around, pointing at a screen behind them.
Yeah.
And that is because, now it's probably not their fault if they haven't set that up, because they can't see what slide they're on. So of course they have to turn around because they can't see. Quite often I see people setting up events and they've got a laptop and it's right at the back somewhere. It's no good at the back. So if you're doing any event organising, it needs to be somewhere where the speaker can see it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they don't know what slide they're on. They've got a clicker, a wireless presenter. They could have clicked it twice and they can't see. They don't know, so they have to keep turning around. So it's a real shame to have that environment. So that's the type of thing I would want to know. I'd want to know what slide size I was using. I would want to know, where is there a laptop? Am I going to be able to see it? Where is it going to be? Is it going to be close by to me? What's that setup? And then I suppose the third thing, this isn't necessarily something to ask the organisers, but from I'm assuming that you're using slides here. Think about the size of the room. How big is that room? How many attendees are going to be in it? If it's 100 people, it's big enough. People that are sitting down the back of the room will not be able to read text on your slides. So you need to have full bleed images, and you need to have a word or two. Not sentences, not complex diagrams, not lots of small pictures, because nobody will be able to see them.
Yeah.
You want a couple of words maximum, and images that are going to portray your message.
Yeah.
Okay. Or blank slide with literally a couple of words on.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it. Very, very simple.
It's minimal, less is more, isn't it? With
Absolutely.
You've touched on a point which I just wanted to explore a bit further, which is how a leader preps in their presentation, because you referenced that they might be looking down at a screen to see their bullet point notes. Now, I've worked with leaders that don't like any notes and will try and memorize it like it's a script or a speech, and just verbal diarrhea when they get on the stage because they're trying to retain it all in their head. I've had people who have to take physical papers up with them with loads of scribbles all over to try and prompt them of what they're saying. Then I have people who've maybe one or two bullets just to do as a reminder. What would you say is the best approach? What really works from an audience point of view?
I think if you don't have, first of all, the only place for bullet points is in the presenter notes.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to see any presenter notes in PowerPoint in paragraph or sentence, because you'll be reading them then, or you can't see them. So the place for bullets is in your notes if you're able to see that content. I don't think there's anything wrong with having like flashcards. And I actually have two here, and I know we're on audio only, but just to give an example, and hopefully you'll hear this. If I've got a piece of paper, that's what you hear when I'm holding my piece of paper. If I've got a piece of card, just be able to hear that. It's much, much less noise. So if I was going to be having any notes and I was going up on stage with those, I would have flashcards. So they're like the small sort of
like the revision cards,
I think. Yeah, revision cards. And you can put a couple of bullets on those, so that if you need to glance down to remind you of that fifth point that you need to mention, you can see it there. And I don't think that's going to hamper the presentation that you're giving, even if you don't have slides. I think that's okay to do that if you need to. What you'll find as you get more practiced is that you don't need them, because you'll remember those points if you structure your presentation well. And that's where those rule of threes comes in, because it's very easy for you to remember them as well.
Yeah.
And don't forget, your presentation, it's not like this is an ad hoc speaking where you don't know the topic and you're just speaking about something that's unknown to you. You know your topic, and you know your topic very well. If you're up on that stage, you're an expert. So it's more around remembering to get those messages across and making sure that we have those 3 points, or we remember those 3 things. And that's why breaking it down into those 3s really helps when we're delivering our presentations.
And the practicing, as you said at the very beginning.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can we talk about introverted leaders? Because I'm maybe stereotyping here. There's probably some introverts who do love presenting, and there's probably some extroverts who hate presenting. But in the main, introverted leaders tend to be the ones that are least likely to want to be up on stage or centre of attention. And I know, as an introvert, for me, I used to hate the fact that I would worry, because I'm very pale skinned, I'd get on a stage, or just because my nervous energy would be coming up, I'd go bright red, and I'd be thinking about that before I'd even go on to present. Oh, I'm going to turn red. What are they going to think? I was getting very self-conscious about people judging me around that. And I was probably perpetuating the issue. But it made me think, when I was reflecting before today, of how do you, if you're someone who physically doesn't like the idea about getting up to present, you might feel very comfortable with the topic and all of that, but actually just the pure thought of eyes are going to be on me and I don't like that. How do you start to create the right conditions, I suppose, that you begin to feel more comfortable in those situations?
First of all, I'm one of those introverts that goes very red as well. So
we unite.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm like. I think with practice, again, it diminishes somewhat. I'm not going to say that's going to go away, because for some people it's never going to go away. One tip I've heard, I haven't actually used this tip, but I have heard this tip, and it makes sense when you think about it. Obviously, there's wearing the right type of clothes. So things that you're going to be, you might be cold when you're sitting in the audience getting ready to stand up, but then when you stand up, you're not going to overheat, because if you're like me and you, as you've just said there, it's that physical going red, and I'm generating loads of heat, and that's going to make me go even more red. So making sure that I've got cool clothes on that aren't going to get me hotter and hotter. So maybe it's something, maybe there's a jacket you can take off before you stand up, or something like that to be cooler in the first place. Another tip I have heard is having a cold water bottle with you, because if you put your hands around that can really help cool you down. Now, I always remember in my home economics class, we were always told to, if we were making pastry and things like that on a really hot summer's day, we had to go down to the cold water tap, and run cold water on your wrists.
Right.
To cool your hands down, so that when you were making the pastry, it wasn't all horrible and sticky. This is on a real hot summer's day. So it's kind of the same as that, really.
Yeah.
Because blood then from your wrist is running all the way back, it helps cool the rest of you down. And I think that's the same sort of phenomenon with the speaking. So maybe it's a bottle of cold water, like a glass bottle of water, because that's really going to help. Now, I'm not suggesting you put it on your forehead or anything like that. I just mean holding it in your hand. So it's not going to be doing that, but
I've
just
got
holding it in your
images
hand.
of me just putting it around
I
my
know.
neck, opening it over my head.
But just having something to hold in your hand can help cool you down. And it's I mean, I don't know whether that's a psychological thing or a physiological thing, but that's a tip that I've heard other people saying can be quite good. Just having some prompt there that you can put your hand on, and it can help ground you a little bit.
Yeah.
And maybe it is doing something as well. I've
certainly found, and someone once told me off for doing it, so you can tell me if I was right or wrong, but I use my hands a lot, and I noticed that I would get redder and more heated. So I found actually just putting my hand in my pocket, and just it would make me feel more relaxed and casual, and it was felt more conversational than I'm formally presenting and I've got to do these grand things with my hands. And so just doing that grounded me. someone, as I say, someone did feedback going, oh, you were too informal. And I thought, well, actually, that's me, and sod it, I don't care. But I wondered, are there things that you know, rules you should or shouldn't follow in terms of your body language? And was I doing the wrong thing?
I think it would be, I mean, there's two ways of looking at that. If you were a confident presenter and you didn't have any nerves, then that's probably not the best thing to be doing. So it's thinking about things that would work for the scenario that you have when you're presenting. So as you said, you got feedback saying, oh, you're a bit casual. But if it helps you overheating and going bright red, and then everyone will be looking at you thinking, what's going on there? Then it's okay, isn't it? You know, I think people can move their hands too much. They can be waving their arms all over the place, and that can be very distracting. So as a rule, you sort of want to be able to probably about half a meter. So if you think of these 25 centimeters either way from your center point is about all you really want to move your hands. Right. If you're making maybe you're making a statement that you're talking about, you know, something down the future, then obviously you might point your hand right out to the side, because that's making, you know, you're making a statement about something you're talking about in the future, but you don't want to be waving your hands that far the whole time while you're presenting, because that is going to be distracting. If you tend to be, another thing is if you've got a clicker, that could be something to hold in your hand, so that can help make people feel a little bit more grounded by having something like that. Wireless presenter. Another tip is to find a way to hold your hands around where it's almost just below your navel, I suppose, somewhere around there, because that's sort of a nice center point. Obviously, you don't want to be crossing your arms, because that's very negative. Hands in the pockets can be a little bit too formal. But if you're able to, it's almost like not clasping your hands, but maybe it's sort of like holding your finger and your thumb, or, you know, just holding your thumb on one hand and trying to find a way how that looks casually. Now, that's something you can practice in the mirror. Okay, so that could be your hand's resting point. And then if you are using your hands to make a gesture, the gesture comes from that place and goes back to that place, so that you're not waving them all around the whole presentation, which is very distracting. And that could be something there where you've got your hands in that sort of resting place, and then you're using your gestures so that they're not all over the place. Yeah. And another thing, people can be foot tappers. They can be swaying from side to side on their feet. You know, people have biros. One of the things that I would do if I had a biro, and do it now here, I'd be clicking the whole time, which would drive people mad. So I don't hold biros, because they're actually a negative thing for me, because I'm clicking, which is not good. And again, that's something that, you know, if there's someone in the audience that you can ask for feedback from, that's valid. Getting some feedback on what your habits might be from the standing point of view. What are you doing that's distracting? What could you change a little bit? How could you make that feel better? I mean, also just standing in one place isn't great either. You know, sometimes you do need to move around. If you were on a stage, you'd want to sort of have a couple of steps and move around. I spoke at an event in Vienna last year, and it was a sort of PowerPoint demonstration. I did a bit of a presentation to start with, and then I sat down at my desk because I was doing a demonstration. But I was very conscious that if I did the presentation from sitting down at the desk, it's a bit too static. So when I was presenting, I made sure that I was standing up and I was walking around for the 10 minutes that I was actually presenting. And then I said, right, into demonstration, and now I have to sit at the desk. Otherwise, people are looking at me just sitting in front of a desk for an hour, which is not great. Now, obviously, I needed to be working with PowerPoint, so it had to be for part of the presentation. But I was very conscious that I wanted to move around to make sure that I was making eye contact with people in different places, different areas of the room. Otherwise, people might not have even been able to see me behind a desk. So it's important that we think about things like that. That's another one, eye contact. Really important that we make eye contact, try and make eye contact with everybody as much as we can, of course, because, you know, if there's thousands of people in a auditorium, that's not going to work. But also not have that eye contact for too much time, because we can make people uncomfortable. It's a couple of seconds and then move on to the next person, but try and make sure that we've at least looked at everybody in the room and got everybody's eye contact at some time. What people can do is, if there's somebody looking at the presenter, they tend to latch onto that person, and then that person can't look away then or break the eye contact. So it's it's a skill. It's a learned
Yeah.
skill.
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious of our time and we could be talking forever, but my final question is, what's the one piece of advice that you want our listeners to take away about being a more impactful speaker?
I think it's practice. It has to be practice, because the more you practice, the better you will get. You'll feel less nervous if you do feel nervous. You'll come across better. There will be less ums and ahs. It's all about practice. So to elaborate on that, if I was getting ready to do a small speech for Toastmasters, I would be practicing in my office, out loud, talking to nobody, just to practice saying that out loud. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be word for word, because you don't want it to be that, or I wouldn't want it to be that structured that it would be exact word for word, just to practice so that you know the flow, you know where you're going to go next, and that your brain is used to it. And then when you stand up and do it, it is somewhat easier.
Yeah.
Never practice in your head. I heard people say, oh yeah, I have practiced, and they're sitting there going through in their head at their desk. That's not the same. It's not the same saying it in your head. You'll say it much quicker. You're not practicing getting those words out. If there's a word that you tend to stumble over, remove it. Find another one. If there's something that you go, when every time you try and say it, get rid of it. Find one that works. Find one that's easier on the tongue for you. But if you don't practice, you don't know.
No.
And then there could be things like that you find more difficult.
Yeah. Things look and sound very different when they're flat on a piece of paper versus when you're trying to articulate them out loud, and the message that you think you're conveying can come across completely differently. So yeah, completely concur with that point. Well, thank you so much for your time, Fiona. If people want to get in touch with you, got any questions, where can they find you online?
Best place to find me is on LinkedIn. If you search for Fiona Walsh and PowerPoint, you will find me.
Brilliant. And we'll put all your links in the show notes too. Thank you again. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and let me know what you thought on LinkedIn. You can find me at Lee Griffith. I'll be back with the next episode in 2 weeks' time. So in the meantime, sign up to my newsletter at sundayskies.com for monthly insights on how else you can lead with impact. Until next time.